Okay, Clive, you can open the proceedings. Over to you. Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Moeen, and thank you everyone for giving me an audience for what I have to present. Last year I put together a summary of the way in which the world works from the work that we've been doing in critical thinking. And I think it's fair to say that we probably got to the mechanical foundations of our enslavement as humanity in 2016. And what we've been working on subsequently is trying to understand why is there such resistance to exploring or acknowledging the idea of enslavement of humanity, because most people regard themselves as free and living in a democratic society. And therefore, what we've spent the intervening 3 years doing is trying to actually understand the psychology of why people can't grasp this. We've essentially finished answering the question who rules, how, and why. And that is why, in effect, critical thinking has come to the end of that stage of its research. And what we've discovered is that these foundations go very deep in history and they go very deep in psychology. And if we look at the history, then you obviously have the hierarchy of monarchy, the hierarchy of theology in terms of priests and churches and ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But the other fundamental platform on which this enslavement process has taken place is through the medium of money. And money, in effect, has been weaponized and made the tool of our enslavement through harnessing money and time together. And to a great extent, it's the alchemy of time that is involved in money. So whilst we talk about the mechanical processes which lead to inequality, environmental destruction, and money power, there's a deep psychological or occult thread to money and interest, which stems from Hermetic philosophy. And if we think about the foundations of this, I'm going to use the word New World Order because it's shorthand for what is planned, which is basically a ruling class and then a subclass, drone class. So I use the word New World Order in that sense. And it has its roots going back millennia. And this idea of money and alchemy and time stems from predatory banking, which originated with the Chaldeans through the Phoenicians into Venice, which was the dominant world trading center in the 1400s. And then it migrated to Northern Europe and ultimately into the city of London. Another strand to this money power is the Ashkenazi cult, which from Arthur Koestler's work and others originated around 700 AD when Khazarians converted en masse into Judaism, since when they've infiltrated and corrupted Judaism and every other religion virtually. And we can see the articulation of the plan for world domination or supremacy articulated in the protocols, which, irrespective of their provenance, are too accurate to ignore. And there's much corroborating evidence. And there's also the introduction of the Noahide laws in order to, and this is part of the secularization of religion, which I'll come on to a bit later, but this whole idea that they will substitute our law for their law. And in order to implement this process, they've created a cognitive elite, which has occurred over centuries. This has been long in gestation Last year, Gilad was at this meeting. He didn't talk too much about that, but I think I made reference to this cognitive elite. There's a very good video of him on YouTube, which explains how this was approached to create this cognitive elite. He calls it a Jewish cognitive elite. I call it a Khazarian Ashkenazi cult elite. Because not all Jews are Khazars, and certainly not all Khazars are cult members, I'm sure. But using this cognitive elite, they've initially they infiltrated the Freemasonry with the Illuminati. If you go back and look at Adam Weishaupt, 1776, and this rather shady organization which permeates politics worldwide, India, Russia, almost everywhere in the world, Chabad Lubavitch, which sits on the shoulder of presidents, prime ministers as they're signing laws into force. So that's where anti-Semitic laws come from, denial of Holocaust laws. That all comes from this same source. And we'll come on to that a bit later. So effectively, just hit the right button, maybe. I'm used to flick of the wrist. Anyway, so in essence, this has enabled this Ashkenazi cult to colonize all the levers of power globally. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the principal players that we're concerned with at the moment, particularly Russia and China as two potential protagonists in the geopolitical war games, and the US-European bloc, if you like. And then obviously Africa is a great theatre, as is Latin America, and long has been. And not only have they infiltrated governments, but they've infiltrated all institutions and corrupted all institutions. All our institutions are criminal, without doubt. And primarily, whilst the institutions are indebted in order to, or debt is used to create these institutions, it's the elevated cattle, as we refer to them, those who are elected or elevated into positions of power are manipulated and controlled by a combination of sex and money. And we all know about the paedophile scandals, and it is evident that it's worldwide, whether you look at the Jimmy Savile net with British royalty, BBC, and the European and the British Secret Service and the whole establishment, or whether you're talking about Jeffrey Epstein. Somebody mentioned Roy Cohn earlier. He was very much involved with the paedophilia rings in the Reagan era, possibly as far back as the Nixon era. Whitney Webb has done a lot of work on that. So the elevated cattle are basically serving this same Ashkenazi cult in their criminal activities. But in talking about the blackmail of these people, elevated cattle or presidents, prime ministers, flunkies of various descriptions, most of them are ignorant of what they're involved in. They may be blackmailed into doing certain things, which may be marginal in terms of legality, but they have no clue as to the overall effect of what's going on, because from birth we are trained into tramlines of acceptable thought and compartmentalization. So you have all these people operating independently but passing information to each other, all of which is flawed. So everybody's working on the basis of flawed information, so nobody has a complete picture. And this is global. There is no getting away from it. There is nowhere to run, there is nowhere to hide, because everywhere in the world is contaminated by the same insidious power. So whilst I said this goes back to the ancient Chaldeans, Phoenicians, and it has a very long history, if we really want to understand the evolution of the New World Order as it is now taking shape, we need to go back to the turn of the 20th century. And there were some significant events around the beginning of the 20th century, one of which I haven't put down here, which was the capture of the American financial system through the establishment of the US Federal Reserve. And there are extensive videos that Critical Thinking have put out on that, and G. Edward Griffin on The Secret, the Creature from Devil's Island and Jekyll Island, and various other publications. So I don't think that's particularly controversial. But what we're talking about here is geopolitics and what really started this process of the New World Order. And if you think about, if you're looking for world domination, what is your biggest obstacle? It is independent nation states and cultures which are going to resist this idea of belonging to a worldwide club operating under one system with one culture. I think it goes without saying that most people, if they understood that, they would resist it. And hence the need to break European nation states and European culture. And World War I was the opening gambit for that. And behind that was the Cecil Rhodes Foundation. If you look up the Milner Kindergarten and all the characters involved, essentially what they did was manipulate the French court, manipulate the Russian Tsar, manipulate the British Parliament in order to create an interlocking web of agreements, which meant that when Germany was threatened and started to march through Belgium in order to protect itself, then the whole thing kicked off. And of course, we have the false flag of the Archduke Ferdinand sort of being the excuse for war, and it was all a terrible mistake and should never have happened. But of course, it was all choreographed with the intent of crushing a generation of European youth, crushing Germany and the Kaiser as a potential impediment to this new world order, and at the same time coming on to Russia to remove the Romanov dynasty and Russia as another potential cultural and national impediment to the new world order. And of course, the Bolshevik Revolution was led by the same Ashkenazi cult who proceeded to create a template for the global New World Order. Many of the ideas that were taking place in Bolshevik Russia are taking place today in terms of anti-Semitism laws, kangaroo courts, all of the measures that we're seeing emerging into view in Western civilization have been tried and tested within the Bolshevik Revolution, and they are being rolled out in more palatable form, ostensibly, but that doesn't mean to say it's not going to get a lot worse. And if you read Yuri Lina's Under the Sign of the Scorpion, the sort of atrocities that were undertaken in the Bolshevik Revolution are pretty horrendous and would make most people blanch. The secret police, the Cheka, was led by this Ashkenazi cult, and they killed millions. And if we talk about the head count of dead, or the body count, I don't know what the ultimate body count was from World War One, but it was probably approaching between 10 and 20 million. In terms of the Bolshevik Revolution, up to the time of death of Stalin, we're probably talking 55 million Russians, including Jews. Just because you're Jewish doesn't give you immunity from this Ashkenazi cult, as Gerard Menuhin will attest, I'm sure, among others, and Gilad and others. So that, if you like, set the tone. We then had the farce of the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany was emasculated and cut away at the knees, and of course the fueling of the rise of Hitler to give another bite at the cherry of wiping out yet more European youth. So we had the various protagonists in World War II. But what was important from World War One was the gift of Israel to the Rothschilds. That was the price for getting the American public on side to bring America into the war. Without the Balfour Declaration, then Rothschilds wouldn't have been able to create Israel, and America wouldn't have been brought into war. So that is a key factor, is the gift of Israel to the Rothschilds as their personal fiefdom. That is never clear in the way this is presented. And you may have heard Jacob Rothschild talking about how proud he was with the creation of Israel. Of course he's proud of it. It belongs to him. It sits in his pocket. And then we come to the Holocaust. Now, whilst the Holocaust happened during the war, the foundation of Israel in 1948 with the land grab of the Nakba, which started in 1948, in the aftermath of the war, Winston Churchill never mentioned the Holocaust, and he is probably one of the most prolific writers on the Second World War. And they acknowledged after World War I that the demonization of baby-eating Huns and all the other horror stories that were created after World War I were fiction, and they were acknowledged as fiction after the war. After World War II, a very similar situation pertained, where there had been a lot of propaganda during the war, including the Holocaust and various other things. But if you read contemporaneous accounts at the time, nobody gave this much credence in reality. And it was only once Hollywood and the media industry really started to get hold of this Holocaust that it really began to take effect. I was a Boy Scout in the 60s in Germany, and I went to various war museums, and that seemed to be the beginning of the indoctrination of youth. I think the older generations were probably wise enough to realize that they were being played again, but the way this system works is you work on the young, because by the time you get to where you want to get to, they're playing a very long game. Those obstacles in terms of crotchety old men like us, I talk about me primarily,
Thank you.
die off basically, and then you've got a new generation, a new paradigm with which to work. So the Holocaust was very much fabricated in Hollywood and in the media. And then, of course, in the 70s, we had the Talpiot program and Unit 8200. These are elite cybersecurity units that were created in the 70s with the long-term vision of basically dominating cybernetics computing, cyber technology, cybersecurity worldwide. There are videos on YouTube of Benjamin Netanyahu bragging about their lead in cyber. They punch way above their weight. Every major technological firm, IT firm, has an R&D facility in Israel, and many of the key executives in all these big social media platforms and technology companies come from this Unit 8200 Talpiot program background. That gives them total control, backdoors into every mission critical system in the world, be it financial, infrastructure, military, you name it. They have the power. And you may have noticed recently, or not that recently, the problems in Venezuela with the electricity grid. That was in all likelihood something to do with Unit 8200 and Talpiot graduates. Similarly, Iran has been attacked frequently with cyber attacks. And then, of course, we have 9/11. So the 20th century, if you take the 55 million Russians, you take the 70 million odd Chinese who incidentally were victims of the same sort of process. Mao Zedong went to hell. He was a member of Skull and Bones. He was back to create the Cultural Revolution, which basically killed off something like 70 million Chinese. So that was just, if you like, the appetizer of the 20th century, and setting the scene, softening the world up for this new world order. But what we had was a change of pace, a change of game with 9/11. I'm not going to say much about 9/11 other than the fact that if you look at Building 7, it is unequivocally a controlled demolition. if it's a controlled demolition, then none of the official narrative withstands any sort of scrutiny. So 9/11 has created the conditions for perpetual war, specifically in the Middle East, but beyond the Middle East. But beyond the Middle East, we are talking about perpetual war, and there are two strands to perpetual war. One is the concept of Greater Israel, which has already been referred to, articulated in the Yinon Plan in 1982, and clearly the foundations for Greater Israel have been laid progressively since its inception in 1948, and arguably much longer before that. So that's one aspect of perpetual war. The other aspect of perpetual war is the George Orwell idea that as long as you have these wars going on, then the domestic population can be controlled and harvested as you see fit. Excuse me. Another point to just add on China, finally, is that China is very much controlled in the same way. The descendants of Mao and his lieutenants are called the Immortals, and this is another oligarchy or kakistocracy. And for those who don't know what the word kakistocracy means, it's ruled by the very worst, the worst of the worst. And James Corbett has got a really good interview with a Danish researcher. So if you look up James Corbett and kakistocracy, I'm sure you'll come across it.
Load of cack.
Exactly. So that is the New World Order, which basically looks like this. So essentially we have money power. Rothschilds is the dominant banking family. When they talk about the world's rich, Rothschilds eclipse anyone on that list. And arguably all the banking families operate together, but Rothschilds is kingpin, and they basically give their orders to the elevated cattle who will do their bidding. So that is the nature of the New World Order. So money power pulls a lot of the levers, and what money power isn't pulling, then Israel is making up for through its ownership of US Congress, ownership of the EU, ownership of the Conservative Party, demolition and sabotage of the Labour Party. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see Israel's influence everywhere. They are also involved in induced mass migration, which is nothing other than another mode of war where you actually move populations wholesale in order to create conflict within Europe. So the processes articulated in the Coudenhove-Kalergi plan is to create a mongrel race of people of no particular race or culture, and that is what is being undertaken with induced mass migration. Whatever mass migration had gone on prior to 2015 was just about manageable. We had waves of immigration into Britain, which took a while to assimilate, but over time they were assimilated. You had the Gastarbeiters in Germany in the 80s, where this process of there aren't enough Germans to make all these wonderful cars, we need to bring in people from Turkey. That was the beginning, but there was a step change in 2015 with that iconic photo of the boy on the beach, which really kicked off basically a dropping of the borders, and the likes of Soros and other characters shipping in migrants from sub-Saharan Africa as well as from conflict zones. So war is the gift that keeps on giving, not just in terms of all the profits from arms and the geopolitical advantage that you get from destabilizing countries. It's also created this new weapon of refugees in order to create clashes of civilization between indigenous populations and immigrants. And then, sorry, did somebody else? No. We then get into the whole Agenda 2030, and there is plenty of evidence, and we've done work at Critical Thinking. There's an American lady called Rosa Quar who's put out some really powerful videos on the way Agenda 2030 is being implemented at the local level. In my local council in North London, they are being given targets for housing which are greatly in excess of what would be normal demographic increase, and this is being driven from the UN via the EU to the Mayor's office. And if you look at the plans, the idea was to create global city-states where most of the population lives, and the rest would be a wilderness playground for the rulers, as it were. So Agenda 2030 is being rolled out insidiously at the local level, and I'll talk a bit later about climate change and the green agenda, but that's very much part of the platform under which this Agenda 2030 is being rolled out. It's all on, we're going to save the planet and we have to eat less, breathe less, etc. But I'll come on to that a bit later. The thing to remember when we're talking about nation states is that when we talk about intelligence services, their first allegiance is not to their country of origin. So whether it be the CIA in America, MI5 and MI6 in the UK, Mossad in Israel, ISI in Pakistan, whatever secret police you're talking about, their first allegiance is to money power. That is those are the origins of secret services, and the bankers control intelligence services worldwide. And so when you look at events like London Bridge, which was mentioned this morning, you only have to do a certain amount of cursory investigation to realize, one, that the facts don't stack up. And if you look at the pattern of these, and there's a guy called Ole Damagard who's done a huge amount of work on false flag terrorism, there are always patterns, and the intelligence services are always involved. And terrorism and war are the gifts that keep on giving, because the more terrorism you foment, the more people clamour for security, so you spend more on security, creating more terrorist events, and it's just a vicious circle that gets bigger and bigger. Or if you're on the side of power, it's their virtuous circle. It's the gift that always keeps giving. And one of the reasons that Israel and this Khazarian cult have remained immune from criticism is their victimhood. We are told Jews have been victims throughout history. That is what we were told. We're never given the context, and given what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution and how this Ashkenazi cult was the primary perpetrator of huge atrocities against millions of people, then we have to call into question any other references to victimhood or pogroms. Unless we investigate the context and actually who was involved, how can we be sure that what is being claimed is true? Not least because the most iconic instance of victimhood is the Second World War and the Holocaust. This myth that has been fabricated around Schindler's List and all the various horrendous, A Beautiful Life is a fantastic film if you've watched it, with great music score, but it's premised on lies, as are most of these Hollywood creations. And it's not just Hollywood, it's also the books and the narratives. And if you look deeply and wide enough, and you only have to look at Jewish historians, you don't have to look at Gentile historians. You can look at Gerard Menuhin's Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil. You can look at David Cole's Auschwitz video, which exposes these things. When you look deeply, there is no physical, documentary, chemical, scientific evidence that there was any intent or implementation of industrialized killing. It just doesn't exist. All that exists are confessions that were extracted under torture and the claims of witnesses who ultimately have benefited hugely in terms of financial reward, whether it's Anne Frank's father or all these various other characters who claimed all sorts of ludicrous stories. And if you want an indication, Alison Chabot has put a very neat little 3-minute video on the Holocaust, which tells 3 stories which have no foundation in reality. So this is what we've been led to believe. This is what our fear stems from. And this Chabad-Lubavitch organization, in seeking to parallel anti-Semitism with Holocaust denial, is indicative of the word trickery and psychology that is used. Anti-Semitism is an oxymoron. Kazarian Jews aren't Semites, Palestinians are Semites. So there, the whole thing begins to fall apart. But people are so terrified that they actually give credence to this nonsense of anti-Semitism. If one is anti-anything, it is anti the cult practices of this Ashkenazi minority. But what they've managed to do with the Holocaust is to wrap the whole of Judaism, anyone who identifies, and that's another conflation. You know, what is being a Jew? Is it your race? Is it your religion? Is it a choice? But anyone who identifies as Jews has become part of this security blanket around Rothschild's power. And that is why they are almost unassailable in terms of unpicking this particular problem. So the Holocaust is effectively the linchpin to their power. If we can actually get people to shed their fear of looking at the Holocaust, and you've only got to look at the accounts of people like Morris, him too, but Maurice Bardesh, who actually gives a very French perspective on the Holocaust. And he looks at it from a critical judiciary point of view. And when you recognize that of the 3,000 officers who were in charge of the Nuremberg trials, 2,400 were Jews. And if you look at what was happening in the Soviet Union, if you've read Solzhenitsyn in these sham trials, that's what the Nuremberg trial was. It was a repetition of the Soviet-style trial in order to create the Holocaust myth. And people just don't get this. We were talking beforehand about the satanic philosophy or psychopathic satanic underpinnings of the political economy and the way the world works. And it stems from the false messiah Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank, who followed on and took up his, or Jacob Frank, who took up his teaching. And basically what we've discovered or what we have characterized the state of most people before they look at this stuff is one of trained ignorance. You are kept corralled into a career path or an academic path that makes sure that you never look at the whole picture to see how it hangs together. And this idea of trained ignorance is how we're educated in both private and public education throughout our lives. From the time we enter school, we're tested, graded, channeled into becoming an economic component to contribute to the political economy, but never to actually question or understand how it works. And this is the shape of how we live. Essentially, we have money power at the top of the pyramid, in control of psychopathic institutions, using paedophilia and money power to control the elevated cattle, who in turn motivate the trained, ignorant, useful idiots who believe in man-made climate change and all this other nonsense, who believe in the Holocaust, who believe in the official narrative of 9/11. These are all the useful idiots who are too fearful to look beyond their comfortable worldview, because it's a life-changing experience when you go on this journey of discovery to find out how the world really works. But that is the pyramid of tyranny. And we're just farmed. This whole process has evolved to actually just harvest the wealth of human beings and what they create. And it all stems, our work established very early on in our work, it all stems from the three fundamental flaws which we identified at least 3 years ago, which is usury, theft of the commons, and hierarchy. And really, hierarchy is what we've been focusing on since we first came up with these ideas. And hierarchy is very much related to occult knowledge and the manipulation of mass psychology, which I'll come into. But essentially, what we have is a reality gap. Most people's perception of the world is that the political economy we have is not great, but it's as good as it gets, and the people in power are doing the best they can. And that completely is negated by any level of diligent research across the political economy. There are more and more people who are coming to the realization that what we are told, what we are trained into, has no bearing in reality. And psychology is a big lever in this, and I'm going to come on to a bit about the sort of occult underpinnings of the psychological conditioning. But to give you an example, the introduction of androgyny now, or gender fluidity, gender politics, this actually has some foundation in truth, that we are all male and female, but we are all male and female spiritually, not physically. And this has created this confusion amongst the young, and it's coupled with this idea that if you want to change a society, you have to corrupt it, and that's what they did with the Weimar Republic in post-war, post-First World War Germany. So this is what's been going on with Hollywood, secularization of religion, science, faux science, creating a total sense of uncertainty about what we really are, or should I say being removed or exiled from our spiritual connection. I would use the word God in this context, but I would also use the words universal consciousness. And the reason I say that is that I come from a quasi-atheistic perspective in my work, and I would say that for most of my work at Critical Thinking, I was focused on the tangible, the logical, what could be touched, smelled, measured, whatever. But the more I've been on this journey as discovery, the more I realize that there is a deep spiritual connection. And as you come from quantum physics, where you look at what the world actually is, the world is vibrating energy in receptive space. That is God. We are all part of God, we're all part of each other, we're all part of God. So whatever metaphors are used in religious senses, that is the reality in which we live. And all religions, or most major religions, stem from that same fundamental idea that God or universal law prevails over everything. And if you don't recognize that, then it's no wonder we're in a mess. Now, occult knowledge and these ideas of esoteric teachings from which a lot of my understanding has come is also utilized by this Luciferian satanic cult that actually manages this system. And when we start talking about Hermeticism, the occult, esoteric language, a lot of people get frightened because that's what the Luciferian Satanists want. They want the return of Lucifer, the light bearer. But what we're talking about is a higher truth. And the thing is that the adoption of esoteric knowledge by satanic forces is much more to do with the tricks and the manipulation of human psychology rather than aspiring to the higher truth. What is the higher truth? That all is the law and God is all. That is essentially the higher truth. But Satanists are operating at a level below that because they want to create hierarchy within the universe, or institutionalize hierarchy within the universe, which doesn't exist in that sense. and I'm getting a bit out of my depth in this stuff because I'm very early on the learning journey, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but I will come back to it in a minute. Now, in our work, we describe what we refer to as litmus tests. And if you're having a conversation with someone and you want to know where they are on the journey, you have to apply litmus tests. Now, I've talked about the history of the 20th century, and unless you've studied the work of Anthony Sutton, Carroll Quigley, and many others, Hidden History by Jerry Doherty and Jim McGregor, unless you've studied the facts that surround those events, then you don't understand. So that's one litmus test, understanding of 20th century history and the Holocaust more than anything. If you don't understand the Holocaust, then you're not going to begin to unpick. If you don't understand that portion of history, then you aren't going to understand the rest of it. But the litmus test we always used to use was 9/11. If you don't understand that 9/11 was a false flag, then you have no reference for all the wars and all the security and being told to take your shoes and belt off at the airport and all this nonsense. You have no frame of reference if you don't understand that 9/11 was a false flag. And then beyond that, 7/7, Boston Marathon, and no doubt London Bridge the other day. They just keep repeating. But one of the biggest litmus tests, and probably the most important today, is this climate change scam, which was articulated, I mean, its genesis probably goes back decades, but in 1992, Maurice Strong, Evelyn de Rothschild, David Rockefeller articulated at the UNCED conference in 1992 that they were going to create a world wilderness, and they were going to create, or they were announcing the creation of a Rothschild conservation bank, which was going to bank all the carbon credits and all the rest of it. And basically, fixing the science came later, and we published a paper in May this year called Systemic Risk and Climate Change, which goes into the scientific arguments of the green agenda and explains why it's nonsense. But that, if you look at I've referred to James Corbett, he's also done something on eugenics, the new eugenics climate change, the new eugenics, because, and there's another researcher, Deborah Tavares, who also talks about the energy weapons use in the recent California fires, which are blamed on climate change, but they were actually weather warfare. And basically, she talks about this idea of eugenics under Agenda 2030. And the idea is to create huge swathes of the earth as a wilderness playground for the rich and powerful, whilst everybody else is shoveled into city-states where they'll be surveilled, controlled, monitored. And beyond that, there is in train a plan to cull the human cattle. And if you look at the Georgia Guidestones, they indicate the death of 7 billion people on the planet to bring the population down to 500 million. If you look at the Noahide laws, the people who framed the Noahide laws, one of the laws is thou shalt not commit idolatry. Under the Noahide laws, the people that framed idolatry regard Christians as idolaters because they worship Christ on the cross. And death by decapitation is the appropriate sentence under the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws were signed into being in America in 1991 by George H.W. Bush Sr. They are undoubtedly being fed into every nation's laws, along with the secularization of religion. So this watering down of religion with crypto Jews in the Catholic Church, in Islam, and what have you, watering down of these religions is to introduce the Noahide laws into the matrix to premise this human cull. because with artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., 7 billion people are just useless eaters. So it's the troublemakers like us that will go first, as they did in the Bolshevik Revolution, as they did in the French Revolution, as they do in every revolution. You pop the people who can think their way out of a paper bag. And I think we probably fall into that category. But it's not all bad news. In fact, I think it's rather good news in a way, because certainly over the years that critical thinking has been working since 2012, I would never have mentioned the Holocaust in 2012. I probably wouldn't have mentioned it in 2014. But now there are a growing number of people who are prepared to ask the forbidden question. And that is only going to gather momentum. As Sylvia Stolz, the German lawyer who's banged up? Listen to her speech that she gave in the brief period that she was out of Clink. Basically, people are waking up to the fact that they're being conned left, right, and centre, and that these institutions are criminal. People say we ought to arrest this person, or this person ought to be charged, or we ought to sue these people. The law is part of the process. The law is not there to protect us. Under the Sestuy-KV Act of 1666, we were declared lost at sea. We have no standing in legal parlance. We have no power in that sense. What we have is our power to withdraw consent, which is what we've been advocating at Critical Thinking. So finding ways to disconnect oneself from the system is the only way that we're going to do this. But the biggest lever for change is human perception. It took Galileo, Copernicus, I don't know how many centuries it took for the idea of an Earth-centric universe to evaporate, but eventually it did. But that was in an age of glacially slow communications between a relatively small number of people in a very rarefied strata of society. What we have is global instant communication. So human perception could shift in a blink of an eye. And that's why, and this is happening in the business community. There's a guy called Martin Geddes who's very much into the QAnon expose of the deep state, and he contends there's a fraction within the deep state and the good guys are coming to the rescue of us all. I don't believe that. I think it's more manipulation and internecine warfare, but more people are looking. People are beginning to question the authority, the great and the good, the institutions that they've always relied on. So I see that as a great step forward. But I also believe, having got to the mechanical roots of this problem of hierarchy, usury, theft of the commons, learning in the intervening period that you can't teach people this stuff has led me personally and some of my colleagues on a spiritual journey, if you like, trying to bridge that gap between our left-brained, logical, deductive logic analysis into the intuitive, esoteric, inductive reasoning that is an essential part of our thinking, that we're dissuaded, we're told not to use it. And so we have to move, and I'm exploring the tarot, Hermeticism, I Ching, various other means to tap into this esoteric knowledge, and to get away from, or to move beyond the metaphors of religion and religious teaching, to actually understand what is the true meaning of the cosmos and universal consciousness. And we do that by creating, we've been doing that co-creatively actually, before I get into that, so this comes from the Kabbalah, but it's related to Hermeticism, and essentially at the top is the supreme being, if you like. And there are many ways of interpreting this, and don't take what I'm saying too literally, but it's to give you a general impression. And as I say, I'm just learning this stuff. And as you come down, we're manifest here. This is our reality. In effect, we've descended from our spiritual existence down through the layers. The words don't actually matter too much in this context unless you want to study it. As you go down through the layers, this is, if you like, ultimate spirituality to the sort of our corporal being on this mortal coil. And we have to reascend that path to get back to our spirituality. So that's what these are the sort of ideas that we're exploring, not just the Kabbalah, but other ways of looking at the world beyond what we've been trained is acceptable. So we've been working on the basis of circles of trust. And in essence, under this hierarchical system, we're kept isolated and divided. So what we're conducting is essentially anarchy, which just means no ruler, and it has to be on a human scale. The power of the internet is not being able to communicate with millions of people, but being able to knit together groups like ours with other groups, which creates this sort of ground level, grassroots understanding of what's really going on. And we've outsourced our methodology as to how we work in co-creative learning, which is a free open source project for anyone to use. And essentially it's a self-organized learning process. And we lay down principles, processes, how you go about your sources, what the pitfalls are. And that's for anyone to use. And that's how the understanding that I've conveyed to you today, I wouldn't have had a hope in hell of ever achieving on my own in multiple lifetimes. It's my firm conviction that it's working co-creatively that has brought all this information together. So whilst I'm articulating the words, it's come from just so many other people. And if we as humanity begin to create this awareness and a shared understanding of reality as I've described it, then the world will change automatically. So the change essentially has to come from us all. Now, we've finished our work. We've published this paper, How We Live, which, if you like, is a summary of everything I've just tried to explain. In May this year, we produced a paper on systemic risks and climate change. I just published a paper called Gulag Academia, which explains how academics are trained in their ignorance of the way the world works. They're trained to do the job they're doing, and they're given baubles and accolades for getting to the top of their field. But if they start to look outside their field, then they very soon find that they slip back down the slippery snake. So these papers all come out of this overall analysis. So Gulag Academia, I've got a few other papers published to take in how they train the young, how they co-opt communities with the Agenda 2030, how they conduct perpetual war, and I think there may be one or two others that are planned. And this we got an Exocet missile under the radar into academia with this paper in 2017, which was published in the Islamic Economics Journal of King Abdulaziz University in 2017. And that basically blows the gaff on everything I've explained today. It doesn't mention the Holocaust, but it mentions almost everything else. And that is now beginning to gain some traction in the academic world.
I've never heard of that until this morning. It's never gone out to any of the messages. No.
I've circulated this a lot, so.
But I'm looking for this stuff all the time. So.
Well, if you go to freecriticalthinking.org, there's all this stuff. I'm now blogging at outersight.org, So the work I'm doing, building on critical thinking, I'm recording it out of sight. I'm not putting out anything like the volume of material. I put out daily pickings for 8 years without fail, other than when technology intervened. And it was getting to be dog day afternoon. It was just repetition of the same old story, same different players, different places, but the same patterns.
That's www.
Yeah,
Right.
but whatever you put in. And I think I've probably outstayed my welcome. So thank you for that. And that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, but with the I Ching, be careful. My very good friend, they invested heavily in a company and they consulted the I Ching. Will this be profitable? They pumped in thousands and thousands, and it failed. So they went back and said, well, yeah, but you didn't ask who it would be profitable for. So be careful when you ask.
Well, I think there's a misunderstanding of both the tarot and I Ching, which can obviously be used in that way. But actually, the tarot is much more about, it's much less about divination, for me anyway. And it's much more about being a book of knowledge with inexhaustible capacity. And it's a journey I've only just started. And the book I've relied on or regarded as the most inspirational as far as the tarot is concerned is by Oswald Wirth, W-I-R-T-H, who wrote a book called The Tarot of the Magicians. And it's much more about understanding what the cards mean in certain combinations rather than using it to say, am I going to win the lottery this week? And in my view, my understanding of esoteric teachings is that the purer your intent, in other words, the less selfish your intent, the more value it provides. And this concept of Satanism or Jejal, as far as I'm concerned, is not a physical or even a spiritual entity as such. It is our selfishness. And the higher truth is unselfishness. And the lower truth that we're of this psychopathic system is selfishness.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, one final question because time is catching up on us. James, okay?
Well, I think the work you've done is excellent and
Yes.
very
Good.
informative.
Sorry, can you speak up?
It's very good at connecting the dots for how things are going wrong and how things are working. The only thing I have a bit of a worry about, and I don't have the answer, is that you seem to rely at the end on communicating with people through the net, basically, which unfortunately is also under the control, as I think you said earlier, of the same hierarchy. So it's not that good news.
Well, internet technology we couldn't have done this without the
No,
internet.
I agree.
It is a double-edged sword, as most things are a double-edged sword. And technology, if they want to, they've let the genie out of the bottle. And we have unprecedented access to communication and information. And that comes with a downside. And they're trying to colonize social media platforms, etc. But if they want to control us and use digital cash, digital money, and all the other things that they're doing, they need the internet. And so they're trying with AI and various other means to try and, if you like, sanitize the net, but they can't do it. So I agree. And that's why we need to use BitChute. That's why we need to get off Windows and Apple and go into free software. The more we use these non-proprietary services like BitChute and there are many others, then we can defend ourselves from the attacks on the internet. But you have to understand the technology if you're going to do that. Yes, technology can be bad, but it's also our main tool of liberation. Without it, this ain't going to happen.
Thank you, Clive. That's another day conference, seriously. And finally, by the way, welcome to Nassar from the Daily Jung paper and Simon from the Christian Council Munch, just a quick question. Would you?
Oh, yes, Clive, thank you for enlightening me. I'm neither an expert on spirituality, nor I am an academic. I'm a simple journalist. I'm a sub-editor, work on the national newspapers such as the Daily Telegraph and Times, Observer and things like that. So I'm actually, be patient with me, I will be blunt. Now you mentioned 3 or 4 times about the perpetual wars.
The what? Perpetual wars.
Perpetual war, continuation of wars. Which are those wars? Can you explain to me?
Well, I
Apart
think.
from Palestine and Kashmir.
Well, it started with Afghanistan. I mean, arguably, Yugoslavia was a bit of a rehearsal for what they did after 9/11. So it started with Afghanistan, went to Iraq, went to Libya, went to Syria. They're threatening Syria. Meanwhile, they're destabilizing Venezuela. They've already managed to recapture Ecuador, Argentina, and now they've recaptured Bolivia. And obviously you've got the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, in Gaza and Palestine, and then you've then got the creation of tensions between Pakistan and India over Kashmir and various other causus belli, as it were. And in the meantime, NATO has been putting its forces all the way around China to hype up that particular theatre. Across Africa, there is conflict across Africa. There is nascent civil war in France.
So
It's
actually,
a
not
year
one
has
place.
gone by,
The
and
the wars
France
are
is
not
at
in
war.
one place. The whole planet is
Yeah.
involved.
Perpetual war. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, obviously we've discussed. We had a whole conference here on World War III scenarios last week. Yeah, this is just a follow-on. Okay, James. By the way, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Clive. James is now.